August-December 1857 conflict in which Mexican-American cart teamsters in Texas were attacked by raiders seeking to destroy their trade was rooted in the historic tensions between peoples of different ethnicities who resided in Texas soon. After Euro-Americans began arriving in what was then Spanish and later Mexican Texas at the beginning of the 19th century, racial conflicts intermittently flared into violent encounters. Many whites had inherited negative images of Hispanic peoples from their Western European ancestors' creation of the Leyendas Negras, or Black Legend. The Black Legend portrayed the Spanish and Portuguese inhabitants of the Iberian Peninsula and their descendants as greedy, cruel, lazy, arrogant, and dissolute. Moreover, many Europeans believed that intermarriage between Europeans and native peoples produced a mongrelization of races. Euro-American migrants into Texas generally regarded people whose backgrounds were Spanish, Mexican, or Native American as inferior. This attitude of superiority accounts in part for the Texans' war for independence against the Republic of Mexico. From 1835 to 1836, Texas residents of Mexican descent, who were known as Tayanos, became increasingly suspect in the eyes of Anglo-Texans, even though many Tayanos had fought alongside the Anglo-Texans against Mexico during the war. Following independence, the Republic of Texas began systematically dispossessing Tayanos of their lands, economic livelihoods, and legal rights. East Texas was virtually depopulated of its substantial Tayano presence. One of the few places in which Tayanos held any numerical, economic, and political power by the time Texas achieved U.S. statehood in 1845 was the most important settlement in Texas during the 19th century, San Antonio. By 1857, Tayanos monopolized the commercial transportation of food and merchandise between the coast of Texas and the trading center of San Antonio. Tayano mule and ox drivers, who were known as arrieros, moved goods on large carts, which had single pairs of 5 to 7 foot wheels of cottonwood puncheons fastened with wooden pins and rawhide straps. The cart's axles were made of strong woods such as pecan or live oak. Thus, emergency repairs could be made using natural materials that were readily available. The Tayano teamsters' engineering ingenuity, combined with their superior skills as teamsters and their low charges for moving goods, enabled them to operate profitably. It is estimated that arrieros made up almost 60% of the Tayano workforce in Texas. Frederick Law Olmsted, a northern traveler in Texas in 1855 to 1856, observed, "The Mexican Tayano appears to have almost no other business than that of carting goods. Almost the entire transportation of the country is carried on by them with oxen and two-wheeled carts." During the late summer of 1857, reports began to appear in local newspapers of attacks on Tayano cartmen by masked bands of armed men, ambitious. Anglo teamsters had been trying for some time to take the freight business away from the arrieros. They could not compete with the low rates charged by the already established Tayano commercial ventures, however. Frustrated, they retaliated, first by harassing and then by assassinating Tayano freighters and by stealing their cargoes. As word spread of the depredations, Anglo communities worried about a race war, and the Tayanos feared an increase in the carnage directed at them. Anglo citizens in Goliad County warned that retaliation by armed Tayanos would provide an excuse for extermination, because the killings and thefts were vengeful acts by a particular group against innocent victims. A segment of the Anglo population protested the depredations. However, it is unclear whether the Anglos were motivated by humanitarian or economic considerations. Some complained that carriage rates rose when the arrieros refused to haul merchandise along dangerous routes. Others feared dire economic consequences for the entire region. Carriage prices increased 30% after the attacks began. Meanwhile, alarmed Tayanos left San Antonio in unprecedented numbers. Despite a reported 75 murders, government and law authorities were slow to act. Eventually, a committee of citizens from San Antonio was charged with investigating the matter. Some area newspapers called for inquiries, but often invoked racist rhetoric in doing so, referring to the Tayanos as a weak race, greaser population, and low in the scale of intelligence. A combination of forces eventually led to a cessation of the bloodshed, military escorts accompanied the Tayano cartmen at the insistence of San Antonio merchants who were losing money. Communities organized volunteer companies which operated under lynch law traditions to bring about order. International diplomacy even played a role. On October 14, 1857, the Mexican minister to Washington, Manuel Robles Pezuela, notified U.S. Secretary of State Louis M. Cass that his sources reported that armed bands in Texas were hunting down and murdering Mexicans on the public roads. Robles Pezuela's entreaty and the fear of international diplomatic complications moved Cass to pressure Texas Governor Elisha MPs to settle the troubles. Although the raids ended, no one was ever arrested for participation in the crimes. Many even refused to acknowledge the wrongs perpetrated against the Tayano entrepreneurs. In December 1857, Karnes County citizens condemned the use of military escorts and the actions of the governor. They called the PN Mexican Teamsters intolerable nuisances who destroyed property. Goliad County citizens expressed similar sentiments. Significantly, the perpetrators of the cart war accomplished their objective. Never again would Tayano freighters dominate commercial shipping in Texas. The arrieros, however, had already demonstrated that, in spite of the stifling prejudice directed against them, skill and business acumen could bring them economic success. As long as they were allowed to engage in commerce without violent interference by others envious of their success, the economic ascendancy of Anglo-Texans would not be challenged by Tayanos until the 20th century. Standard histories of Texas ignored the cart war until the 198 when prominent Tayano historians such as Arnoldo D. focused attention upon it.